Okay, so let's now looking at our good friend Henry David Thoreau and his idea of civil disobedience. And we'll close on our good dead friend Henry with the following. Now, Thoreau lays out kind of a potentially interesting point. In regards to the authority of the state, in the United States and most Western democracies, the basis for authority is the consent of the government, the will of the people. And he does consider, the following legitimate concern. To be strictly just, if we accept that as the basis of authority, the state should only have the authority, powers, etc., that we grant to it by our consent. And he believes that the state, therefore, only has rights over the citizens to the degree the citizens agree to that. And he seems to be right about this. I mean, if you accept as the basis of government the consent of the governed, if people don't agree to that power or authority of the state, then the state would not have that. Now, like many things that are theoretical, when it comes to practical matters, there become some concerns. Also, of course, there's some theoretical concerns. For example, if we accept that government authority is based on our consent, and we can remove our consent, that would seem to entail that people would just withdraw their consent at any time. I mean, we can use like an obviously absurd, made-up scenario, but someone could be robbing a bank and the police could come and arrest them. The person could say, I take my consent away from police authority. And the police would go, gosh, he's got us. We can't arrest him. He's taken away his consent to police authority. Now, would that actually work? Well, no. Which does bring up the sort of theoretical and practical concern. How do we justify not being able to just remove our consent from things like when we want? Because based on our consent, we could just simply withdraw our consent at any time and say no. So why can't we do that? Or should we be able to do that? Should we be able to opt out at any time? Like when committing crimes?
Well, if we could, then nobody would be punished for the things they do.
Yeah. I mean, there wouldn't be that practical concern because people would just say, oh, I opt out. It'd be an easy and kind of magical out. So you might say that people going back to previous discussions, it could be that we tacitly agree and that we can't just remove the consent at any time. But it is an interesting question. Could someone, the case about like, when the police come to arrest me when I'm trying to rob a bank and I say, I take away my consent, you can't arrest me. They might say that person, ahead of time could agree to accept certain things and agree to reject them. Or you might say that by voting for stuff, we give our consent to it. We may not agree to particular things, but we say, okay, I'm going to vote. And even if I don't agree to that particular thing, I accept that I have to follow the rules. What kind of interesting point. Now, he does think that there will be progress of the state. And he looks kind of at history. You have a sort of a unlimited absolute monarchy, progressively limited monarchy, to parliamentary government, to democracy. And he thinks that perhaps there could be a greater improvement, that there could be a state that would allow people to opt out, in the sense that they could say, we don't want to be part of the state, we accept none of the benefits, we'll still be good neighbors, but we just don't want to be part of that state. Now, is he right about that? Is that something that could happen? Could we imagine governments eventually at the point saying, yeah, if you don't want to be part of the government, that's fine. You just want to hang out in your own place, as long as you're not causing, committing crimes, etc. That's perfectly fine. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. Always a safe answer. So, Thoreau, civil disobedience, dead, still dead today. Before heading from disobedience to liberty, anything about Thoreau that needs more Thoreau stuff? Or has my coverage been properly Thoreau? Sorry. We now turn to the matter of liberty, freedom, etc. As always, there's lots of questions here, like what is liberty? And how free should we be? And when it comes to matters of how free we should be, who should decide? Should it be up to us, up to the state, up to the religious leaders, up to social media? Who should decide how free we should be? Now, liberty is most often considered in the context of the state, because sort of the usual model is, like, I would take like a person, and this is the sphere of liberty. You know, you can kind of think of it as the, literally, as the walls of a prison, and we are free to roam within the walls of liberty. And it's usually defined in terms of the state. The state, builds walls around us, or if we believe in, a democratic state, we agree to be, penned in by these rules. And so one of the key questions is, how far should we be allowed to roam? And again, it's usually defined in terms of relation to the state. But of course, we can also define it in terms of, kids to parents, people within religion to the religion, within institutions, like how, moving away from like the state, we can look at students at university. How much should they be penned in by the school in terms of their allowed and disallowed behavior? Now, like with rights, we can look at liberty in both positive and negative terms. In fact, what people often do is use liberty and right kind of interchangeably. That you have a right to something, like the right to free speech, is often also presented as the liberty of free speech. Now, positive liberty, like positive rights, is this. You have the freedom to engage in that activity, and also, this is where the positive part comes in, you are entitled to the means to exercise that liberty. One way to look at it would be, in the case, to use an example, with a case of K through 12 education. Do we have the freedom to be educated, K through 12? Although it may be ironic, because we often see that it's not a case of freedom. Yeah, but it's also provided to us. If you're a student and you're going to public school, K through 12, you don't have to come in and buy tickets to school, for example. Now, there's also negative liberties, which are essentially you have the freedom, but you're not provided with the means. And the example I used before with rights, a good example is free speech. In general, are we free to express ourselves? Yeah, people aren't supposed to silence us. But are people obligated to give us, say, TV time? Can you go to CBS and say, I'm going to need about 10 minutes during the next episode of Supergirl to say some stuff to the world?
You got money.
Yeah, to get money, because money is speech. So, yeah, but they don't owe you, the means to do so. If you can buy it, then then you can get it. But otherwise, they're not obligated to provide you with the means. Another example would be the liberty of travel. You're free to travel all through the United States, but no one's obligated to provide you with those means.
So that's what makes it negative?
Yeah, negative is, it's not that it's a bad liberty, but it's a sense that you're free to do it, but no one is obligated to provide you with the means to do so, in general. And again, we usually do this in terms of the state. We can also do it in terms of parents. What sort of liberty should people have with their parents? What sort of things should be positive liberties and negative liberties? You could also do the same thing with the university. What things does the university owe students freedom to do, and to provide them with the means to do it? And what things should the university allow students to do, but not be obligated to provide them with the means of doing so? So this is sort of like, you're free to do it, and this is, you're free to do it, plus you have a right to the means to exercise that liberty. Now, one of the key questions is, who or what should determine liberty? Now, we can also look at it as a factual question. As a matter of fact, who makes the decisions about how free we can be?
The government.
Yeah, typically the government, which is to say, people who get elected or appointed to office. And the most common thing is, it should be the government. Other people say, anarchists, for example, say it shouldn't be the government because they're the problem. It should be, us. So what justifies limiting liberty? Well, the classic one, and you've been following events since 9/11, is the seemingly endless conflict between liberty and security. To use an analogy, everyone's used like an app or a program, with a slider bar. Or you might own like some ancient, stereo equipment that has slider bars, equal graphic equalizers. And of course, the idea with the slider bar, if you get more of like one, you get less of the other. So you have to kind of slide it back and forth. And liberty and security are often presented as being kind of like on a slider bar, in the sense that if you get more liberty, you get less security. But to get more security, you get less liberty. And that's usually a standard trade-off and justification. To be safer, you have to give up liberty. But to be more free, that means you're less safe.
You mean like famous people and all that stuff?
Oh no, like, it could be an example, like when people get, you might say that if they're protected by like bodyguards, they would have less freedom. But it applies to all of us. For example, take the liberty just to sell whatever you want with no like food, with like no rules. That's like complete liberty. You can sell anything you want, no inspections, no rules, whatever. In that case, they're really, really free. But imagine there was no FDA. No one inspected the food. That'd be a lot of freedom. But would we be like less safe?
Yeah.
Yeah, because even now, there's outbreaks of, food poisoning, foodborne illnesses, and that's with some regulation. And so the idea would be we would have more liberty, but would be less safe. Another example would be, other class examples would be like the ability to, have weapons. If we had total liberty, you could own anything. Chemical weapons, tactical nukes, chemical weapons. We'd have a lot of freedom, but would we be like in more danger if people could just own like, anthrax and chemical bombs and stuff? Probably. Now, when it comes to giving up liberty for security, there's a couple of very important questions. One is a practical one, essentially an empirical, factual one. When there's a proposal to give up liberty for security, a good question is, will that actually make us more secure? That sort of refers to empirical consideration. Will this make us safer? For example, one thing we've had in the past is that people who come to the United States, there's like a 90-day visa for people, which doesn't have the same sort of thorough vetting process that refugees undergo. It takes almost about 2 years for a refugee to go through a process to be admitted to the United States. But you can get these short visas, or student visas, or business visas, with a lot less scrutiny. Which is, the liberty slider bar moves this way. There's been a proposal, and it's being put into place, that those be more and more restricted. And the claim is, we'll be safer if we put those restrictions in place. But a good question is that actually true? Would that make us safer? And that would be an empirical matter. We have to look at where most of the terrorism comes from in the United States, and the answer is most of it comes, pretty much all of it comes from, except since 9/11, comes from right inside. It's us. So if we slide the slider over that way, we think it's getting us more security. Yeah, but we're just losing liberty. The slider's moving over, but you're not really getting more safety. And it's a fair question to ask about anything. If we take, going back to government regulations, if we have more regulations on business, a fair question would be, but does it actually make us safer? Does it have the desired effect? And so a good first question is, does it really work? Another example is if you've flown recently, you probably been in the body scanner thing. It always reminds me of The Fifth Element, because you have to like you put your hand, it's like, put your hands in yellow circles, and it scans you. But one thing, a good question is does it make us safer? And one thing that always happens to me, because when I travel in summer, I wear cargo pants, like cargo shorts, I like the fascist state minutes. But you can put all kinds of stuff in the pockets. And they always have to like pat me down afterwards because my $20 cargo shorts defeats their $1 million, multi-million dollar scanner. And so a good question would be is, does that actually make me safer, scanning? Now the second question is, once you've addressed the issue of does it make us safer, there's the question of, is it worth the trade-off? So for example, we could be safer if everybody was chipped, so we could be tracked. And if everybody had like everyone's probably heard of the police body cams. If we were all fitted with cameras. And so 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, the government knew where we were and exactly what we were doing. Now, would that probably lower crime?
Don't they do that in another country now?
No, they don't do the chipping yet, but they do have the United Kingdom has a lot of cameras everywhere. But I mean, you could put cameras literally everywhere, people's houses, on them. Now, that you could argue, make us safer. But the question would be, is it worth the cost to our liberty? And so the good second question is, okay, if it does make us safer, is it really worth the price? And everyone gives, of course, different answers to that question, depending on their political views, etc. But again, those are two sort of tests. So whenever there's a proposal to impose on liberty, be it more government regulations, limits on travel, stricter conditions for getting to the United States, it's a good question to ask, will this actually make us safer? If the answer is no, then there'd be no reason to do it because it's not going to work. Now, if it does make us safer, the next question is, of course, is it worth the price? Are we trading off, liberty for something that is worth it? Now, in addition to the classic liberty versus security debate, there are some other grounds for limiting liberty. One is, well, we can take an example. Does allowing same-sex marriage, does that make us less safe? Are the terrorists going to win? Yeah, if there's a same-sex couple down the street, is your life in danger?
As a universe, it could be if everybody went gay.
Well, yeah, that would be. Yeah, if everybody went gay, same if everyone became a priest. Then, a Catholic priest, then we'd have no more people. Yeah, celibacy, Fortunately, not everyone's going to do that. Yeah, so we would say, well, that doesn't really put us in danger. And so the justification is not security, but moral justification. That this liberty should be limited on the grounds that such things are morally wrong. Now, the challenge there, of course, is justifying the claim that it is wrong. Another one is kind of related to security, is also the idea of self-harm. So, for example, if someone is, smoking a lot of marijuana, for example, in their basement, and not going out and driving or flying planes or something, well, they're really no threat to anybody else. But we might say, well, even then it should be illegal because of the self-harm. So it's not a security issue, it may not be a moral issue, it may be like a health issue. Or to use a real example, some years back, when Mayor Bloomberg was Bloomberging in New York, he imposed a ban on big sodas. And of course, big sodas are not a security risk. They're not really a moral problem, but they were a health concern. And so the justification was, big sodas are bad for you, so Big Brother must, or actually it's Little Brother, because he's not perfectly taught, that we had to ban them to protect you. And so those things become important moral issues. Should the state be banning stuff to protect you from yourself? Like banning pie, for example. Now our first reading is from the dead guy, Benito Mussolini. And since he was a fascist dictator, he does not get to be our friend. He's just a dead guy. He was born in Italy on July 29th, 1883, and was killed by his own people on April 28th, 1945. His main claim to fame include bringing about modern fascism and joining up with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan to bring us World War II. And then, of course, Italy was defeated by the Allied powers. Mussolini was captured and then executed by his own people and hung from a lamppost. And that was the end of Benito Mussolini. Now, well before he died, he, along with someone else, authored a piece called What is Fascism? Now, it's important to know about fascism for a few reasons. One is, the term still gets thrown around in politics quite often. For example, when George Bush was president, the second one, people were talking about how neoconservatism was moving towards fascism. Also, under Bush, we've started hearing the term Islamofascism, which in a way, as we'll see, doesn't really make a lot of sense because if you accept fascism, the basic idea of fascism is the state is supreme, everything else is subordinate to the state, and if a person is guided by the religion, then it's the religion that is supreme. So never really quite got that term, although because fascism is supposed to be bad. And Obama, interestingly enough, is accused of being a fascist as well. So it's worth knowing when people throw around the term fascism, what does it really mean? Secondly, there is, of course, the issue about liberty. What does this theory of fascism say about how free we should be? And of course, thirdly, there's the historical concern. World War II was in many ways, a battle between fascism and democracy, and also, well, I guess, communism in there as well, or a form of communism. Now, the term fascism, give a little bit of history behind that, comes from the Romans. It's from the term fascia, which is a bunch of reeds bound together. If you've ever seen like historical films or drawings of Roman troops, they're always carrying those standards, and they'll typically have like something cool like an eagle on there, but they'll often have a bundle of things tied together. You might have wondered, like, if you saw it, like, what's that? And the answer is that's a fascia. What does that mean? Well, the idea is this. It creates a nice little metaphor. If you take a single like stick, it's easy to break because individually we are weak, easily broken. But bound together as a whole, we are strong. And that's the idea of fascism, being bound together like that. And Mussolini and his co-author liked that term. So that's where it came from. So if you get on Jeopardy for playing Trivial Pursuit, potential answer for the question there. So what's going on with fascism? How do you know if you're dealing with real fascism or someone just throwing around the word because it's got negative connotations? Well, it's got the following defining characteristics. First, peace. The fascist has two views of peace. One is peace is impossible. So, straightforward view. Peace is an impossible thing. Lasting, enduring peace. Secondly, even if it were possible, which is totally not according to fascists, it would be undesirable. It would be a bad thing. So, peace is impossible, but even if it weren't, it would be bad. And of course, the opposite of peace is
War.
war. Yes. Now, what is the view on war? Well, obviously, if peace is impossible, lasting peace, then war is kind of going to be the common state. In addition to war being just the way things are going to be, their view is also that war is good. So we generally think of war as bad, so why do the fascists think it's good? Well, they advance a couple of reasons. One is this. The claim is that it brings human energy, the energy of the state, to the highest level, which a case could be made for that. If you look at World War II, for example, that gave rise to American industrialism, just massive war efforts. But of course, you can also look at countries which have been like Syria, which have been just ground down by war. So it can kind of go either way. I guess if you're winning, it's good. If you're losing, not so good. Secondly, there's the view that it puts the stamp of nobility and courage, that war is kind of an honorable and glorious thing. Now, that view, of course, is not limited to fascists. If you look at, for example, if you go back to the American Civil War, and you look at like letters written home early in the war, you'd have, the Confederates writing, we're gonna whip the Yanks in a couple of days, and it'll all be great. Looking forward to my first battle. And of course, you know, the Union troops said, you're looking forward to whipping the Reds, and, you know, the glory of the battle. But then, of course, when people get into actual battle, the view of it tends to change. Especially if you get shot, it tends to change your view of how awesome war is. So in terms of war, the fascist view is unavoidable, but also good. So are they right? Is peace impossible? Even if we give it a chance, will it never be the case? Well, we look at history, what's the longest period of peace in human history? Where there was no war anywhere in the world? As far as I can tell, like, never. So maybe they got a point there. Now, even if peace is, well, you know, not possible, there's a question of, are they right about it being undesirable, that war is preferable?
I mean, I don't think we prefer war, I think we prefer peace.
We do prefer it, but for someone we prefer, we never, it's like someone saying, I really like this, I really like steak, but you never order steak. I know, but I still like it. So, yeah, we could say they're kind of right about, we seem to always have the war. And then the good question is, will there be a time when there is no war? And there's, of course, a classic quote from Plato, only the dead know the end of war. But there are people proposing, you know, like, eventually you could have like a unified Earth in which we're not fighting each other. That'll probably occur as soon as you find other species to fight. I guess you just gotta always fight somebody. It's, you know, Fight Club in the universe. Now, the third thing for the fascists is their view of life. Now, given the fact they really like war, you might think, surely they're like for death. I mean, if you look at, you know, the Nazis, they always had the little skull, you know, one of the things like little, you know, little skull emblems, etc. And so you might think, oh, it's kind of a death cult. Well, Mussolini claims otherwise. He claims that the fascist loves life and despises suicide. Now again, he's writing in the 1930s, before we see, you know, in the late 1940s, the use of the kamikaze tactic by the Japanese. Interestingly though, although the Japanese did adopt, you know, suicide, what we call suicide tactics, and loading up planes with bombs and flying them into US ships, which is very effective. It is the earliest, you know, guided missile, guided by the most intelligent guidance there is, a living person. And also with submarines that would do that too, basically a torpedo that someone would just steer towards a ship. The Germans and Italians, though, in general, did not do that. And they rejected the use of that tactic. I mean, they kept fighting, you know, till Berlin fell, but they generally did not use those tactics. So maybe Mussolini was kind of right. Now, lest you think that the fascist is, you know, all about life and so forth, their view, though, is this. They claim to be for life, but their view is that your life is not really your own life. It's for others. It's for the state. And so naturally they don't want you to like die because you are an important part, or not important, but you are a cog in the greater machine. So, to use the Jeff Foxworthy line, you might be a fascist if you think peace is impossible, you think it's bad, you think war is inevitable and it's good, and you think people, you know, should live not for themselves, but for others. Now, to further explore fascism, we can look at how it contrasts with two of its big competitors. We have, of course, Marxism and democracy. And this is sort of the battle in, you know, World War II. You have the fascist states up against the democratic states like US, Canada, and Australia, and of course the supposed Marxist states of, well, Soviet Union. So, in a minute or less, what's Marxism all about?
Poor and
Poor.
rich, right? The poor and the rich, right?
Yeah, just like, yeah.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, because one thing, it's a good point, one thing you got in Marxism, one hallmark is class warfare. And as you said, the idea is that you have two social classes. You have the bourgeoisie, who are the capitalists, the owners, and then you have the proletariats, who are the workers. And Marx's theory was this. You would have a situation where there's like lots of proletariat and some bourgeoisie. And what would happen is, at least in his theory, there'd be greater and greater concentration of wealth in the hands of the bourgeois. And so, you know, the sort of the line would move upwards. So there are more and more people who are proletariat and fewer bourgeois. And his claim was eventually there'd be such an incredible unequal distribution between owners and workers that the proletariat would eventually have rebelled. That there'd be open class warfare, the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeois and wipe them out. I mean, some bourgeois, because Marx was pretty bourgeois himself, and his biggest supporter, Engels, is also bourgeois, would go over to the side of the proletariat. And then, according to Marx, what would happen is this. You would end up in socialism. Now, that's a word, of course, that gets tossed around a lot. We've got Bernie Sanders, an avowed socialist, and, of course, people always accuse President Obama of being a socialist. So what is it to be a socialist? Well, strictly speaking, going with like classic Marxism, you are a true socialist. You might be a socialist if you believe that the state should own the means and modes of production. That the state should own all of the industry. So under sort of pure socialism, the state, the government, wouldn't be any private businesses. So they would own all of, there could be still companies, but it'd all be state-owned and state-run. Now, China is kind of like that, although they have their own, you know, bourgeois, etc. But the idea is that the industry is, you know, in theory, largely state-owned. Although in effect it works just like, pretty much like ours. And so that's socialism. Now, the view that we often talk about today is the idea that the government has social programs. You know, things like, you know, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, police, fire, infrastructure, etc. The idea that the state provides social services. But again, sort of pure socialism is the view the state owns all the industry, all the business, there's no private ownership. Now, does that mean there's socialism, you wouldn't own like your underwear or your toothbrush? And the answer is, well, no. Your toothbrush would be, you wouldn't have to share that with the people. Now, what's supposed to happen next, according to the Marxists, is that eventually, as the society gets better and better at producing goods and services, you won't need the coercive mechanism of the state. And we have transitioned from socialism to communism, which according to Marx would no longer involve government, because you wouldn't need that, because the function of government, according to Marx, is to maintain social inequality, crudely put. And so you wouldn't need that anymore, and then you wouldn't have any coercive government like that. And so you would have a classless society, not in the sense of people being, you know, classless, gross and crude, but in the sense that there's no more classes. As Marx said, each according to his need, and from each according to his ability. Now, the fascists really hate that. And the main reason why they hate it is because the hallmark of classic Marxism is the state is going to be destroyed, no more state. And the fascist is devoted to the state. To use an analogy, it's kind of like atheism versus theism. The fascist says the state exists and is supreme, and the atheist says, Marxist says, you gotta get rid of the state. Just like the atheist says there is no God, and the theist says there is. They're at odds. Now what about democracy? So why does the fascist dislike democracy? Well, two things. The first thing is equality. The United States, for example, explicitly states that all men are created equal. And the idea in democracy, at least in theory, is that people are equal. You know, one person, one vote. Now, the fascists reject that on two grounds. One is they contend that equality is impossible. There can be no equality. People are inherently unequal. Secondly, even if it were possible, which it is not, they see it as a bad thing. So equality is impossible, but also bad. So trying to get it just leads to bad stuff. And since democracies, or at least on the fascist view, at least from Mussolini, endorses equality, that's bad. Secondly, voting. Now, in democracy, the idea is that what occurs is people vote to make decisions. The idea is that people are the state and control the state, and they do so by voting. Now, the fascists reject that because they think this is just, is a bad thing. So they reject the fundamental foundations of democracy, equality of the citizens, and that voting thing. Now, Mussolini predicted that the 20th century would be the century of fascism, and he was almost right. If things had turned out a little differently, could have been fascist. Like in the alternative history by Philip K. Dick, The Man in the High Castle, about how it's a parallel world, fictional world, in which the Axis powers won. So, what does the fascists have to offer? Well, the first thing is this. For the fascist, the most critical thing is the state. Now, to us, this will seem kind of like a weird concept, because kind of the political ideology of Western democracies is that the state is just a shorthand for people we voted into office, us. And the idea is that government is based on the consent of the governed. So, in American political philosophy, the state is essentially a shorthand. There is no the state. There's just, you just say it because it's much more convenient than saying all the people that we've elected to office and all the people that are appointed through the legal processes of the United States of America, blah, blah, blah. It's a matter of simplicity, shorthand. But for the fascists, the state is real. It's a real thing. And their view is that individuals exist for the state, and so do groups. Now, in the Western democracies, the ideal is the state exists for us. The Lockean view. The state exists for the good of the people. For the fascists, the reverse is true. The state is mother, the state is father, the state is supreme. You, your groups, exist for the state. Which is why I always thought that the term Islamofascism didn't make a lot of sense, because that would imply that there's got to be a state that's supreme, as opposed to Islam. But I guess it may be a way to, I guess you could have a theocracy, perhaps. So, state supreme. We exist for the state is mother, the state is father, the state is all. So what about freedom? Well, the claim is this. Since the state is everything, and we exist for the state decides how much liberty we are to have. And Mussolini says, we're allowed freedoms except the ones that are useless and the ones that are harmful. And he believes that the state is to decide. So regardless of the question who decides, for Mussolini it's the state. And again, he thinks the state is like a real thing. To us that seems like a weird idea, that the state is a real entity, the ethnic state that has a will of its own. But we hear echoes of this when people start talking about the homeland and protecting the homeland. And on one hand, I'd say, well, that's just shorthand for, the country, people. But if we do believe that there is a state that exists and has a will, then we're sliding towards fascism, quite literally. And so, state decides how free you should be, and it takes away all those useless liberties and all those harmful liberties. Yeah. And it decides which ones are useless and which ones are harmful. Now, Mussolini doesn't go and enumerate a lot of rights in this particular essay, but you could look at fascist states. They do take away most freedoms, which is why, in general, people don't really prefer fascism, except of course when they really do like it. That's fascism. So, should we have fascism? Now, one thing, of course, to consider is that governments are rarely pure. You generally don't have like pure fascism, pure communism. And so to the degree that we make the state, more and more important, on one end we have anarchism, no state at all. The other end we'd have total totalitarianism, total domination by the state. And of course we're in kind of a spectrum here. And again, kind of like with the slider, the question is, how much should we, head towards like there being no state, and how much should we head towards there being a very strong state? Now, as you might imagine, people disagree about where it should go with the slider, and they also disagree on various issues. For example, we could take one gun liberty, freedom to be armed. People who are on the left usually think what? Should people have lots of freedom with guns? No, typically they slide towards, not always, but typically slide towards gun control. And people on the right tend to slide towards, more and more freedom. What about when it comes to, say, abortion? People on the left tend to slide which way? Liberty or no freedom? Well, Hillary Clinton, her position on abortion is what? Okay or not okay?
For or against abortions?
Oh, yeah, for or against. Is she for?
Yeah, if they're for abortions, they'll probably be more liberal.
Yeah, and usually that's a liberal thing. And so they think, it should be, allowed, protected by the state. People more conservative, who tend to, sometimes social conservatives tend to think that the state should be literally in people's business, quite literally, and should restrict that liberty. So, there's a slider between like how much the state should be controlling, but then it breaks down kind of issue by issue. Because as we'll see when we look at John Stuart Mill, people usually don't have like a consistent thing about how much the state should be in their business. Usually it breaks down to particular issues about, for Republicans, for example, the state should be all up in people's business about certain things. And liberals say, no, they shouldn't. And then on other issues, they reverse. The Democrats say the state should be all in that business, and the Republicans say, no, stay out of that stuff. Which segues us to our next reading, which will start up, is from our good dead friend, John Stuart Mill, a bit on liberty. Now, the stuff we saw about John Stuart Mill, still the same. He's a utilitarian, or was, because he's really dead now, and not surprisingly, he bases his moral view on liberty on utility. Now, his goal here, and then next time we'll get to the actual looking at the theory, is this. The question is about the slider thing. Namely, this is, liberty, this is restriction, imposition on liberty. And the question is, how free should we be? Or going with another metaphor, going back to the cage or the pen, how big should the walls of our prison be? How far we should be allowed to roam? Now, Mill, as we'll see next time, starts off with a little bit of history about it, talking about how the original sort of idea of liberty was limiting the power of the rulers, seen as between the individual and the state. Because if we go back to historically to say the Middle Ages, typically the ruler looked at the people in the area kind of as, in a way as property, peasants, etc. And so freedom was limiting the power of those monarchs. But then, of course, we see a transition, at least in the West, from monarchy to democracy, where there being power on the part of the people. And so a good question would be is, once we have democracy, do we have to worry about the state anymore? Because the state is us. And we'll pick up with Mill talking about exactly that